Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Kate Baldwin, Assistant Professor of Political Science. Her current research projects examine how community-level institutions interact with the national state to affect development, democracy, and conflict, with a regional focus on sub-Saharan Africa. She has published articles in the American Political Science Review and the American Journal of Political Science. Today we talk with her about her book project about the paradox of hereditary chiefs in democratic Africa. Welcome, Professor Baldwin.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Okay, well, in Africa, one of the most important recent developments has been the spread of democracy in the past 2 decades. So at the national level, at least, most governments are now democratic in the sense, at least, that they are elected, they compete in competitive elections. But at the same time, at the local level, many communities are still governed by unelected traditional leaders. And what's more, if we look across Africa, these leaders actually seem to have more influence in the countries that are more democratic at the national level. And so this is sort of both puzzling and a bit concerning, because how democratic can these countries really be if they're still at the local level, the citizens are interacting with unelected leaders? And so the motivation for the project was really trying to understand what is the impact of these traditional chiefs on democratic accountability, and maybe more centrally, do these traditional chiefs undermine democratic representation? And the answer I provide is actually a little bit counterintuitive, in that it turns out that these local chiefs who are unelected and have significant coercive power, they actually facilitate democratic representation in rural areas insofar as the central bureaucracy in Africa is so weak that elected representatives aren't able to implement programming and policies that voters want without their assistance.
Okay. Very interesting. So what led you to write the book? So
when I first set off to do this research project, I arrived in Zambia, and I really wasn't intending to research traditional chiefs at all. So I'm a political scientist, and I was really interested in the institutions by which rural citizens got access to state resources. And because of my training, I was sort of looking for maybe the role of political parties or the formal state bureaucracy. But when I got on the ground in Zambia, I found out that in rural areas, these institutions didn't really exist the way I expected them to. And so political parties were largely absent in rural areas. They were not very active. There was also very little presence of the central government agencies in remote areas. Instead, on a day-to-day level, the people who were governing these communities were traditional chiefs. So if a rural Zambian has a problem, the person who they're most likely to take it to is their village headman, or maybe the traditional chief who is above him. If they have a dispute with a neighbor, they're most likely to take it to the chief's court. So this was both, surprising for a political scientist. There's been very little written in political science about the role of traditional chiefs, and even social scientists more generally haven't done very much research on how traditional chiefs affect the national political process. But it was also just seemed like a really important question, because, as I mentioned earlier, how democratic can countries be if at the local level citizens are still mainly interacting with unelected leaders?
Right. Okay, so why don't you tell us what exactly a traditional chief is and what their role in the community is?
Okay, so first of all, I want to emphasize, when I use the term traditional chief, I don't mean to imply that their position is sort of timeless and unchanging. So I think of traditional chiefs as chiefs who have power by virtue of their association with the customs of their community. So they're popularly thought of as being related to tradition, but this doesn't mean their position hasn't changed over time. In fact, during the colonial period, the positions of these leaders did change greatly. The colonial state recognized some leaders, pre-existing leaders, and they didn't recognize others. They generally changed their powers during this time period. And in fact, traditional chiefs got quite a bad reputation in the late colonial period, so that the independence era leaders for the most part, had very negative attitudes towards them. At worst, they viewed them as traitors who'd been complicit in the colonial project, and at best, they just sort of viewed them as these sort of anachronistic leaders who they thought would sort of fade away into the sunset with time. But fast forward, to the last 20 years, and actually we see that traditional chiefs still exist across much of Africa, and at the local level, they still are very important actors. So they run court systems. They often play an important role in allocating land, and they play a really important role in organizing community contributions to local projects. So we might think of this kind of as organizing informal taxes. So if a community needs to come together and build a school or to maintain a road, it's typically the chief who will fundraise or organize the community to provide free labor for the project. And so the chiefs, they exist across much of sub-Saharan Africa, and what's more, they seem to be more important at the local level in the more democratic countries. And this is a little bit why would this be? But to take a step back and think about it, in the post-independence period, there were very few elected governments in Africa. And what that actually meant was that for the most part, politicians could ignore the plight of rural citizens. The rural majority could be ignored because these politicians weren't facing elections. The introduction of competitive elections means all of a sudden, these leaders need to figure out a way to win votes from rural voters. And what do rural voters want? For the most part, it's very basic things. They want schools and clinics and roads and wells. The state is so weak in so much of rural Africa that these elected politicians don't have a mechanism for responding to these demands on their own. There aren't state bureaucracies they can rely on to organize these projects. Elected leaders could try to go to these communities and initiate things by themselves, but it turns out that's also difficult for them. They have obligations perhaps in the capital city that they need to attend to, and elected leaders are generally in office for only a short period of time, so they don't necessarily have the local level institutions that they can use to organize communities to provide projects. And so this is where traditional leaders come in, and they actually play a really important role in facilitating the work of elected leaders, especially insofar as a lot of resources and projects, the way that they're provided in rural Africa is through co-production. So the central state provides some resources, and the communities are also expected to provide some resources for the projects. And so the organization of the community labor or the community fundraising, in general, elected politicians aren't that effective at doing that on their own. This is where they turn to traditional chiefs, and traditional chiefs can help them out.
Okay. Are traditional chiefs given any kind of compensation for their role in the community? That really varies widely across country. I think it's important to note that the reason why these traditional chiefs can do this is, I don't want to take a romanticized view of them as these actors who are, totally selfless and just care about their community. Where they different from elected politicians is not so much in their motivations. We can think of both of them as being quite self-interested. But traditional chiefs, inherit their positions, they live in their communities for lives, and so their economic well-being is very much tied up with that of their local community. So as a result, they have an incentive to organize communities to come together and provide their contributions to projects because they're going to benefit in the long run if their community's welfare improves. Where they differ from elected politicians, again, is in the length of their time horizon. So an elected politician might want to be able to provide a school right now, but they might not expect to be in power, 10 years down the road. And so they don't have the same incentive to organize, sort of create institutions that allow the community to work together collectively. Traditional chiefs, by virtue of their longer time horizons, do have an incentive to do this. So by virtue of, on an individual level and also the longer length of time these traditional institutions have just existed over time, these institutions can facilitate the elected politicians' work at the local level. Typically, are hereditary chiefs in that position until they die? I mean, how long do they stay in the role?
So again, there is slight variation, but in general, most chiefs are selected for life. Okay. And it is, they would have to do something very egregious in order to be removed prior to death.
Okay. How did you do the research? So what countries did you look at?
So, traditional chiefs are sort of an unusual topic for political scientists. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges I had, in trying to develop this research design was developing a design that both allowed me sort of to understand the complexity of their roles while also being able to generalize across cases. Mm-hmm. So the way I did this is sort of through a multi-tiered approach. So at the narrowest and deepest level, my book project builds on research that was done at 2 sites in Zambia, one in the northern province and one in the eastern province. And Zambia is a Central African country. It's very poor. It's landlocked. It has actually a strong history of competitive elections. So since 1991, there have been numerous presidential and parliamentary elections, and actually there's been government turnover. So we have competitive elections at the national level. But in rural Zambia, there's still almost 300 chiefs who have quite a bit of influence at the local level. And
I'm sorry to interrupt. Is there one chief per town, for instance?
So chiefs, on average, you can think of them as controlling territories that are much bigger than towns, but the populations would only be about 10,000, and so they're geographically designated in Zambia. And so there are these 2 research sites, and again, so it was in the eastern and the northern region of the province, of the country. I conducted extensive research, so I did household surveys, I did interviews with the chief, I spent a lot of time in those communities, so I have my own observations. And then, but from there I wanted to be able to reach out and generalize beyond that. So in 3 provinces of Zambia, I conducted comprehensive interviews with all of the traditional chiefs in those 3 provinces. There are 7 rural provinces in Zambia, so that was about half of them. And I interviewed a large proportion of the elected politicians from those provinces too. Mm-hmm. Then I wanted to generalize a little beyond that too, so I relied on data from the ministries in the capital of Zambia, Lusaka, and the archives to create a data set that actually covers all of the chiefs in Zambia from the period at which competitive elections were reintroduced in 1991 to the present. And then finally, I wanted to be able to say something beyond Zambia too, and so I also test some of the implications of the theory I developed cross-nationally using data that was collected by other people for the most part in other countries.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the broader implications.
So I think so the research shows that in many ways the role of chiefs is more positive than many people have suggested. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's sort of 2 important findings that come out of the research for the book. So first, I think one of the most important findings is actually sort of a negative finding. Many people have thought that traditional chiefs can deliver voters en bloc to whichever political party they choose, which would be really damaging for democratic accountability. It would sort of suggest that voters can be, forced to vote for whoever the chief prefers without any consideration of their own interest. And actually, the research suggests that that's not the case.
Really?
For the most part, people understand that their vote is secret. They may feel obliged to obey the chief's instructions in certain realms, but they don't necessarily think they have to obey them in the political realm. So on one hand, that's sort of a very positive thing for democratic accountability. Second, as I already alluded to, these chiefs play a really important role in facilitating democratic accountability insofar as they sort of help the elected politicians implement programming at the very local level in communities. So this is sort of like the central paradox of the book. These unelected leaders facilitate the work of elected leaders. But no, there are some cons as well for working with traditional chiefs.
That are not so great?
So obviously the situation where elected politicians need to rely on these unelected traditional chiefs to implement local programming is not ideal compared to a situation where they could instead rely on a neutral, meritocratic bureaucracy. But in the short term, that's not an option. So I don't think that criticism, I think we can push aside, at least in the short term. A more serious criticism is because traditional chiefs sort of provide this stopgap or almost band-aid solution, allowing politicians to deliver resources to rural communities without a strong bureaucracy, they reduce the incentive to invest in strengthening the bureaucracy. And in the long run, that might actually be a much more effective way. It probably would be a more effective way of delivering these resources and providing programming to people in rural Africa. So, there's sort of this short-term, long-term trade-off here.
Okay. Well, very fascinating stuff, I have to say. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you very much for having me.
For more information about Professor Baldwin and her work, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.